Our scripture for this evening is from 1 Kings chapter 17. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. The word of the Lord came to him, saying, Go from here and turn eastward, and hide yourself by the Wadi Sherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the wadi, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the Wadi Sherith, which is east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the wadi. And after a while the wadi dried up, because there was no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he set out and went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. But she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus the Lord, the God of Israel, says, The jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail, until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth. She went and did as Elijah said, so that she as well as he and her household ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke to Elijah. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. She then said to Elijah, What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. But he said to her, Give me your son. He took him from her bosom, carried him up into the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. He cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I am staying by killing her son? Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. The Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and gave him to his mother. Then Elijah said, See, your son is alive. So the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I often struggle with the text I am given. And I really struggled choosing this one. It's in our narrative lectionary, and I was this close to choosing something else. I so badly wanted to preach on chapter 19 instead, and that's when Elijah, he kind of has a crisis of doubting his own self-worth as a prophet, and God tells him to eat something and he feels better. I could preach on that all day. But God knew that I needed to quit avoiding this topic, so here we are. And this passage for today, it hits my, my faith buttons. Faith buttons are what I call those issues of theology, faith, spirituality that we struggle with, that we perhaps are more sensitive to, that we haven't worked out in our own head quite yet, those issues that bother us, because it seems like we're the only ones having a hard time with it, and often we're not. But trusting in God's providence is one of my faith buttons. It's not that I do not trust that God provides for us. I think that God provides for us in a myriad of ways. And, on my good days, I can see all the blessings that God has given me so clearly. But I have a bad taste in my mouth of the idea of God's providence, because it's often been used as a response to pain and suffering. And what I mean by that is, if tragedy befalls a person, if someone is going through some kind of painful event in their life, Christians, they often want to respond with, trust in God and all your problems will go away, or God always has a plan, or God won't give you anything that you can't handle. And we often respond this way because we don't know what to say. When we are faced with someone suffering, or we can't really deal with the existential questions that we have about why bad things happen. And I have personal negative experiences with people who respond to someone suffering by saying that God will provide. Yes, I believe God does provide, but God doesn't solve every single one of our problems. And sometimes life is difficult, and we face trials and struggles. And those simplistic faith sayings often try to patch over the real pain of loss and betrayal and disappointment. And I've been told those sayings many times in my life. When I came to someone with a struggle I had, and those statements never ever alleviated my pain. They only made me feel guilty, because I felt like I didn't have this perfect relationship with God that included perfect trust. And that kind of guilt is unnecessary, and it's not based in truth. So our text for today was quite difficult for me, but it does require us to sift through some difficult questions. Our text for today, we see two different characters who both wrestle with the idea of God's provision. We have Elijah. Okay, now I feel really bad for Elijah, not just in this story necessarily, but his whole life. He has the hardest job of being a prophet in a time when it wasn't just the monarchy, but also the people worshipped a god named Baal. Baal was the status quo. Everyone adored and worshipped this god. And God's prophets, our God, his prophets were literally slaughtered. And Elijah's ministry, most of it was either running away from the monarchy or confronting them, which I'm sure was super fun. And this part of 1 Kings that we are in is the demise of the kingdoms. And these are violent, dangerous times of unrest. And at the beginning of our text, Elijah tells King Ahab that there will be a drought in the land, and therefore a famine as well. And then God tells Elijah to run away, perhaps for his safety. And God tells Elijah to hide by the Wadi Sherith. And interestingly, the ravens will supply him with bread and meat morning and evening. For the first time in the story, God's provision comes from an unlikely source, a bird that is unclean and a scavenger. But Elijah is not immune to the world's problems, and soon the drought reaches the wadi that he's been drinking from, and he needs to move on. So he's on the run again, this time looking for a widow in Zarephath. And sure enough, he finds one right at the city gates, and this widow is gathering sticks. She is preparing for her own death and starvation. The famine and the drought has reached her family as well, but she didn't have any food or resources saved up. She is a widow in poverty, and her family was already in poverty before this famine began. And so now she's kind of resigned herself to her fate. She's preparing their last meal. And Elijah tells this widow that the little bit of meal that she has and the few drops of oil that she has will last until the drought is over. And miraculously, this widow takes the risk, takes the leap of faith for Elijah. And she gives up the little bit that she has with an act of faith that is believing in something bigger than herself. And God provides. The meal doesn't run out and the oil doesn't run out. But then the unexpected happens. The widow's son gets a severe illness and dies. The widow who gave up what she had for this prophet feels betrayed. She's heartbroken. She can't believe what Elijah did to her son. And now she has lost her son and gave up the little that she has. She has nothing left. And she thought she did everything right. But according to her culture, if tragedy and loss befalls you, it's because of your sin. But it's difficult in this situation to even see God's providence. And we see in this widow a moment where life's events have kind of torn her open for a moment of truth and vulnerability. It's difficult for Christians to admit a struggle about believing in God's providence. And it usually takes some sort of traumatic event for us to really lay it all out there, like the widow did. And it feels taboo to say in church or in the pulpit even that I have trouble trusting in God's providence. But we have moments like the widow's where we've taken a risk or a leap of faith of some kind, and it doesn't protect us from the curveballs that life brings. And we have to deal with the truth that sometimes God does not provide, that God doesn't provide in the way we want God to. And there are moments that we will wonder why, and we may never get an answer. And sometimes in those moments, it feels like our trust with God is damaged. With the widow, her trust with Elijah was damaged. And like the widow in her darkest moment, she thinks it's her own fault. And sometimes we can experience the same feelings. But this text gives me comfort because it is proof that the struggle to believe in God's providence is a universal struggle. The widow struggles when seeing God's providence when her son dies. God was supposed to bless her for providing for this prophet, and now it seems like God is punishing her for killing her son, and she doesn't understand why. And even Elijah, Elijah the prophet struggles to believe in God's providence. He is very calm with the widow, and he is smart, and he doesn't say any harmful things. He just says, "Bring me your son." And he takes the son upstairs, and in private, we see this moment where he cries out to God. He says, "God, why did this happen? God, why did you bring disaster to the woman who helped me? A woman who lost her husband and now lost her son?" And up until this point, God has provided for every need of Elijah's, and suddenly it's like that provision has run out. But then Elijah demonstrates how God can provide for us. God often provides for us through other people. Elijah, in his despair, he cries out to God, cries out for healing, and breath returns to the boy. Now, we often don't experience this kind of miraculous resurrection in our own lives. And if we focus on that, this story can be hard to relate to. But we do experience God's providence through other people. In our story today, God chose the most unlikely characters to provide for Elijah on his journey. God employs the unclean scavengers to bring Elijah food, and a widow, someone who is on the very bottom rung of society, to give Elijah food and shelter. And in Elijah's time of need, the widow took a great step of faith. And in the widow's darkest moment, Elijah provides a calm presence and a healing that I don't think he expected. This story shows us like a spectrum, a journey of God's presence when providence or provision may be nowhere to be found. Sometimes God does provide for us, and sometimes we find ourselves in the midst of a terrible situation, wondering why God won't intervene. Sometimes we are Elijah and providing for a widow in surprising ways. Sometimes we are the widow and we feel like we see a need that might require us to share what we have. Sometimes we have a friend like the widow who has been put through terrible loss, and Elijah, we can be like Elijah, the comforting presence for that person, and put our arms around them. God's providence, it is not a simple concept as people make it out to be. It's not something that can be simplified into a feel-good statement, no matter how much we try. And it can be hard to believe in God's providence in a time like this, when good news feels kind of scarce, when we are missing out on those things that bring us joy and hope, when many of us face uncertainty in our jobs, our finances, our politics. And you can quickly become overwhelmed by the loss of the world if that's what you focus on. But I do believe that God is present with us at all times. God does not solve all of our problems. Often God can't bring back our loved ones that we have lost. God can't always take away our pain. But God is with us. That is something that I feel is always true. And God reminds us of God's presence in all these different ways. I think God is so creative in how we are reminded of God's presence. In conversations with friends, in those random acts of kindness, in those tiny little victories over technology, in laughter, in sunrises and cool winds on our faces, in handwritten notes, in encouraging emails, in the smile of a child in a Halloween costume, in the hobbies that bring us joy and remind us that we are made in the image of our Creator, in comforting hymns and songs, in a snowstorm that dampens a wildfire, in the love we have for our family members, in a costume contest for a stuffed monkey named Buster, in walks in nature that make us feel alive, in a beautiful big blue sky, in tiny handfuls of meal and a few drops of oil. God is present. I think that God's presence and providence is anywhere that we feel joy. Anywhere, anytime that we are happy and we feel alive. We feel grateful to live in this beautiful world. And anything that reminds us that we are not alone. God's presence is in those moments. Believing in God's providence is one of the hardest things for me to do. Mostly because I have that bad taste in my mouth. It requires trust and faith in the unknown, and feels like we are running the risk of being disappointed. And if it's a struggle for you, like it is for me, may I suggest that you trust in God's presence. God cannot always solve our problems. And I don't think that's what God's providence looks like all the time. And I think that misunderstanding can leave us feeling very frustrated. I think God's providence looks like presence. And by looking for God's presence in our own lives, and knowing that God can provide through us, we, like the widow, can open ourselves up to the opportunity to provide for someone else. Never underestimate your own power in being the presence of God for someone. And this change in outlook, it can help us pay attention to know when we are in those kinds of moments. I encourage you tonight, this week, to look for ways that God is present in your life. To look for those little bits of gratitude, joy, happiness, any of those times when you feel less alone, whatever it is, that is God's presence to you. You may still have your problems and your worries, but God is with us. And you never know when God may ask you to be the presence of God for someone else. So I hope this take on God's providence was helpful for you. I think often when we misdefine what God's providence is, we can set ourselves up for disappointment. But I think if we are like Elijah and the widow, always remaining open to the possibility that we can be the presence of God for someone else, I think that is where our faith can really live and grow. I hope you're able to feel God's presence with you. Maybe my words brought it for you, I'm not sure. But thank you for being here tonight and sitting with this story that can sometimes cause us to struggle a little bit. I hope and pray that you feel the peace of God tonight. I miss you all. Take care.